They didn't know that the man they said would hold me back would be the one who never once let me fall. The last time I spoke to my father as his daughter really spoke to him. The way you speak to someone who loves you. I was 23 years old, standing in the kitchen of my parents' house in Oakville, Ontario, with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. He was in his suit jacket even at home, the way he always was on Saturdays when he had golf. He looked at me the way you look at a spreadsheet that doesn't add up, and he said, "You are making the worst decision of your life, and I will not be part of it." My mother was sitting at the island. She didn't say anything. She just turned her coffee mug a quarter turn, then back again, then a quarter turn, like she was hoping the motion would somehow get her out of the room without her having to leave. The decision, for the record, was that I was keeping the baby, and I was staying with the father, a man named Lachlan, who drove a truck for a heating and cooling company and had calluses on both hands and laughed so loudly in restaurants that people turned to look. And I had never once been embarrassed by it. My father was a senior partner at a civil litigation firm in downtown Toronto. My mother taught piano out of our home until I was 12, then stopped because she said she'd lost patience for beginners, though I think the real answer was that she'd spent 20 years becoming someone my father wanted beside him, and somewhere in that process, she'd hollowed out the parts of herself that used to enjoy things. She was not a bad person. I want to be careful to say that. She was a woman who had made her choices and built her life around them and could not afford emotionally or otherwise to watch her daughter make different ones. Lachlan and I had been together for 2 years when I got pregnant. We weren't being careless. It just happened the way these things sometimes do, quietly and without asking your permission. I was 22, working as an administrative coordinator at a property management company in Mississauga. He was 25. We had a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a house in Hamilton, with a landlord named Mr. Tran who shoveled the walk before we even woke up and left vegetables from his garden on our doorstep in August. It wasn't what my parents had imagined for me. It wasn't what I had imagined for myself, honestly, when I was 17 and writing university applications in my childhood bedroom. But it was a real life. It had warmth in it. When I told my parents, my mother cried. My father did not. He asked me very calmly what Lachlan's 5-year plan was. I said I didn't think people really had those. He said that was exactly the problem. He said that a man who works with his hands his whole life is a man who has opted out of ambition, and he hadn't raised me to opt out of anything. I told him that Lachlan was one of the most hard-working people I'd ever met, that he'd been promoted twice in 3 years, that he'd already been talking about getting his contractor's license, that he was kind and steady, and that he showed up. That was the word I kept coming back to, show up, because my father had been in the building my entire childhood, but I'm not sure he'd ever really shown up. And my father looked at me and said, "I'm not going to argue with you about this. Either you make the sensible choice or you do this on your own." He meant the sensible choice was not keeping the baby. I want to be clear, I did not feel pressured by him. I felt fury, a clean, cold fury that I hadn't known I was capable of until that moment. I put the mug down on the counter. I said, "Okay." I walked out of the kitchen and out of the house, and I drove back to Hamilton. And I called Lachlan from the car, and I was crying so hard by the time he picked up that he couldn't understand me. And he said, "I'm coming down to the parking lot, just park, and I'll come to you." Even though I hadn't told him where I was, even though I was 40 minutes away. He waited on the curb in his socks because he'd run out without putting shoes on. That's the man they wanted me to leave. My parents sent one email 2 weeks later. My mother had written it, but my father had clearly edited it because it was very clean and very legal feeling, the way emails are when a lawyer has touched them. It said that they were deeply disappointed in my decision, that they would not be in a position to offer financial support, and that they hoped, in time, I would come to understand that they had acted out of love. I didn't respond. Lachlan and I got married the following April at Hamilton City Hall, with his parents and his younger sister, and our friend group crammed into a small room with fluorescent lighting. and a clerk named Donna, who seemed genuinely delighted to be doing the ceremony. His mother brought butter tarts from a bakery she liked. His dad gave a toast that was 3 minutes long and made everyone cry, including Donna. It was the best day. I have never once, in the years since, wished it had been different. Our daughter was born in July. We named her Rowan. She had Lachlan's eyes, and according to everyone who met her, my stubborn streak, which I took as a compliment. Lachlan got his contractor's license when Rowan was 8 months old. He started his own business 4 years after that, small residential HVAC work at first, then bigger contracts, commercial buildings, schools, eventually a healthcare facility in Burlington. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy, and there were 2 winters where we were genuinely stressed about money, and I picked up weekend shifts, doing data entry for a real estate company to help cover the gap. But we built it ourselves. Every bit of it. Rowan grew up knowing she had grandparents on one side only. We kept it simple when she was small, just that they lived far away, that sometimes families lose touch. When she was older and started asking more direct questions, I told her the truth in parts, age-appropriately, the way you do. She was a perceptive kid. She didn't push for more than I was ready to give. My father, I'd heard through a cousin who still spoke to both sides, had retired at 62. My mother was doing well, still in the Oakville house. They had apparently taken up travelling in their retirement. Portugal, Japan, a river cruise in Europe. I got this information the way you get most information you didn't ask for, in pieces, through people who didn't entirely realise they were relaying it. I had no feelings about it that I could name. Or rather, I had a feeling that had been there for so long I'd stopped calling it anything. Rowan was 17 when my mother called. She called my cell phone, which meant she'd gotten the number from someone. The same cousin, probably, or one of my father's old colleagues who I'd stayed loosely in touch with. It was a Thursday evening in October. I was in the kitchen, making pasta and listening to a podcast, and Rowan was at the table doing homework, and my mother's name came up on the screen. She was still in my contacts. I'd never deleted her, I don't know why, and I stood there for 3 rings trying to decide if I was going to answer. I answered. She sounded older, that was the first thing. Not frail, just older, in the way voices get when the smoothness has worn off them. She said my name and then she said, I need to tell you something and I'm not calling to ask for anything. I need you to know. My father had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. He'd been managing it for about 18 months, apparently, with medication, but the progression had been faster than the neurologist had expected. He was still functional, still living at home, still himself in most of the ways that mattered. But he was not well. I sat down at the kitchen table across from Rowan. She looked up from her laptop, read my face, and quietly closed it. My mother said, I'm not calling to ask you to do anything. I'm not calling to. We're not asking for money or for you to come back to us, as if nothing happened. I'm calling because I've wanted to call for 12 years and I kept letting him be the reason I didn't, and I can't do that anymore. He doesn't know I'm calling. He wouldn't have let me. I said, What do you mean he wouldn't have let you? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your father is a proud man. He made decisions about how he wanted things to look and he held the line on them. I let him. That's something I have to live with. I didn't say anything. She said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the email I sent after you left. I wrote it the way he wanted it written, and I should have refused. I'm sorry I wasn't there when Rowan was born. I'm sorry for every year of that. Her voice didn't crack. It was steadier than I expected, and somehow that was more devastating than if she had cried. I know this doesn't fix it. I know you have every reason to hang up. I just needed you to hear that from me before anything, before more time passes. That's all. I was quiet for a long time. Rowan had her hand on the table near mine, not touching, just near. I said, I'll think about it. My mother said, That's more than I deserve, thank you. We hung up. I sat at that table for a long time after. Rowan got up and made me a cup of tea without being asked, and set it in front of me, and sat back down, and we just existed in the kitchen together for a while. She was 17 years old, and she already knew. somehow, that there are moments when the kindest thing you can do is not speak. Latlan came home from a site visit around 8. He read the room immediately. He'd always been able to do that. And after Rowan went to do her homework upstairs, he sat across from me and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know. He said, "Okay, you don't have to know yet." A few weeks later, I sent my mother a text, just, "I'm open to talking, but slowly, and Lakshan is not up for discussion." She replied within 4 minutes, "Of course, thank you." We talked on the phone maybe once a month through that winter. Short calls at first, 20 minutes, 30. She told me about my father's day-to-day, about the adjustments they'd been making. A grab bar in the bathroom, a reminder system for his medications, cutting back on driving. She talked about him the way you talk about someone you are simultaneously watching, diminish, and learning to see clearly for the first time, and I recognized that feeling in a different way than I would have expected. She didn't ask to meet Rowan. I noticed that. She was careful in a way that felt genuine. In March, she asked if she could come to Hamilton for a coffee. Just her. Not my father. I said yes. I told Rowan, who was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Can I be there?" I said, "If you want to be, but you don't have to." She said, "I want to." My mother arrived on a Saturday morning in a coat I didn't recognize, her hair shorter than it had been in every photo I'd seen of her, and she looked smaller than I remembered. Not worse, just human in a way she hadn't always seemed when I was growing up. When she'd been so carefully composed that I'd sometimes wondered what happened to whatever she was feeling before she packaged it up and put it away. She walked in and she looked at Rowan, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a mug of coffee, and I watched my mother try to absorb 17 years in one glance. Rowan is tall like Lachlan, dark-haired like me, and she has this level, unhurried way of looking at people that she's had since she was small. She held out her hand and said, "Hi, I'm Rowan." My mother shook it. Her eyes were very bright. She said, "I know, I've heard." Which was maybe an odd thing to say, but I understood what she meant. We sat at the kitchen table. Lachlan had taken himself out to the hardware store, specifically to give us space, because he is a good man, and also because he had not forgiven my parents, and he was self-aware enough to know that his presence wouldn't help anyone that morning. My mother and Rowan talked for almost 2 hours. I barely needed to be there. Rowan asked her questions, careful, thoughtful questions about my childhood, about the house in Oakville, about what my mother had been like when she was young. My mother answered them honestly, more honestly than I expected, including the parts where her answers reflected badly on herself. She didn't try to reframe things or minimize them. When Rowan asked point blank, "Why did you wait so long to call?" my mother said, "Because I was a coward, and because I told myself it was loyalty, but it was cowardice." Rowan nodded slowly. Then she said, "Okay, that was it. Okay. Not forgiven, not forgotten, not erased. Just acknowledged and set down for the moment the way you set down something heavy when you need your hands free." The harder conversation came in May, and it didn't come from my mother. It came from my father. He called me himself. First time in 17 years. His voice had changed more than my mother's. There was a slight tremor in it now that I had to adjust to in the first 30 seconds, and his pacing was slower, like he was thinking a half second ahead of each word. He said my name. He said, "I don't expect you to make this easy for me. I'm not calling because I expect anything." I said, "What are you calling for?" He said, "To say I was wrong." That was it. No qualification. No at the time I believed, or I was trying to protect you. Just, I was wrong, he said. I looked at Lachlan and I saw a ceiling, and I was arrogant enough to think that was his problem instead of mine. I was wrong about him. From everything your mother has told me, from everything I should have seen myself, I was wrong. And I told you to leave him. I told you that as your father, as though it was my right to say it. I've had a long time to think about that. I was sitting in my car in the driveway because I'd been about to leave for a grocery run when he called. I turned the car off and sat there. I said, "Why now?" He said, "Because I'm sick and I don't have the excuse of infinite time anymore." A pause. And because your mother sat me down and told me that she'd already called you, and that Rowan knew about us, and that I had a granddaughter I'd never met and she was going to be 18 soon, and at some point she'd be an adult who could decide for herself whether she ever wanted to know me. And I wanted her to have the option. I wanted her to know I existed and that I was sorry before she had to decide. I didn't say anything for a long time. He said, "I'm not asking to come to Hamilton. I'm not asking for anything. I needed to say it directly, not through your mother, me." I said, "Okay, I heard you." He said, "Thank you." We were quiet for a moment. Then I said, "She already knows you exist. She has for a long time. I didn't lie to her." He said, "I know, your mother told me." Another pause. "You raised her well. From what your mother says." I said, "Lachlan and I raised her." He said, "Yes, I know." Rowan's 18th birthday was in July. Lachlan and I didn't plan anything involving my parents. It wasn't our decision to make for her. But about 3 weeks before, Rowan came to me and said she wanted to invite my mother to her birthday dinner. Just my mother. She wasn't ready for my father yet, she said, and she didn't want to pretend she was. I said, "Are you sure?" she said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." "I'm sure." She asked me what I wanted. I said the truth, which was that I was still figuring it out, and I didn't want to project that onto her. She said, "That's a very healthy answer, Mum." I said, "Don't be smug." She grinned. My mother came to dinner. She brought flowers and a card and a check, a meaningful amount. The kind of gift you give when you're trying to say something. Money can't actually say, but you don't know what else to offer. Rowan accepted it graciously and put it aside, and then spent the rest of the dinner asking my mother about her own life, about what she'd wanted when she was 18, about whether she had regrets outside of the obvious ones. Lachlan was there. He was polite. Not warm, not cold. Polite. The way a good person is polite to someone they haven't forgiven but won't be cruel to. He asked her if she wanted more water. He passed the bread. He did not make it worse. That's all I asked of him, and he delivered it without being asked. After dinner, when my mother had gone and Rowan had gone upstairs, Lachlan and I were doing the dishes, and I said, "Thank you for tonight." He said, "Always." I said, "She's not a bad person." He said, "No, she made bad choices. Those aren't the same thing." I said, "I know." He handed me a pan to dry. I stood there holding it. I don't have a clean ending for this. I want to be honest about that. My father and I have not met in person. We've spoken on the phone 3 times since May, short calls, careful ones, the kind where both people are trying very hard not to say the wrong thing. Rowan has said she'll think about whether she wants to meet him before she leaves for university in September. She might not. That's hers to decide, and I have told her so, and I mean it. My mother comes to Hamilton once a month now. She and Rowan text. She brought Rowan a quilt that her own mother had made, which had been in a cedar chest in the Oakville house since before I was born, and Rowan cried a little and said it was the nicest thing she'd ever been given. And my mother cried too, and I stood in the doorway and watched the two of them and felt something I don't have a precise word for. Not forgiveness, exactly, not yet, but something in the same direction. Lachlan's company now has 12 employees. He coaches Rowan's old minor hockey team on weekends in winter because the rink needed someone and he'd always wanted to, and he finally had the time. He still laughs too loud in restaurants. I still never mind. There is a version of my life where I listened to my father, where I made the sensible choice, as he called it, where I walked away from the man in the parking lot in his socks, who ran out without shoes because he didn't want me to be alone for 1 second longer than I had to be. I think about that version sometimes, the way you think about a door you didn't open. Then I look at what's on this side of the one I did and I stop thinking about it. Rowan leaves for university in September. She got into engineering at Waterloo. When she told us, Lachlan lifted her off the ground, even though she's been taller than me since she was 14. And she laughed and said, "Dad, put me down, I'm an adult." And he said, "Not until September," and she to let him. My parents didn't get to see her become who she is. That loss is theirs. It is also mine, in a different way. The years of not having anyone in my corner who remembered me as a child, The years of building something with no one from my original family watching. That cost something. I'm not going to say it didn't. But I also know this. The people who showed up are the people who matter. Lachlan's parents, who drove to Hamilton every few months and took Rowan to the science centre and taught her to make pierogies and never once made me feel like an outsider in their family. Our friends who brought food when Rowan was born and helped us move twice and never stopped showing up. Lachlan himself, 17 years and counting, steady as a load-bearing wall. You can survive being left by the people who were supposed to stay. You can do more than survive. That's the thing my father couldn't see from behind the wall of everything he thought he knew. That the life he dismissed was a real one. That the man he wrote off was building something that would last. That I was never in need of saving. I just needed to be allowed to choose. I was 23 years old in my parents' kitchen with a cold cup of tea, and I chose. I'd choose it again every time.